The shoulder is the most mobile set of joints in the entire body. It can move in a vast range of directions. But despite having this impressive potential, why do so many people struggle to increase their shoulder mobility and flexibility? Your shoulder is made up of 3 bones, the humerus, scapula, and clavicle. They must all work together. This makes the shoulder magnitudes more complex than when looking at a single joint. Developing flexible and mobile shoulders that are also strong throughout their range can transform your practice and rate of progress. Whether you want more efficient pressing and straighter alignment in handstand, bigger, more stable moves in climbing, solid overhead supports in weightlifting, or easier access to arching and bridging, all are enhanced by better shoulder mechanics. If your scapula can't move across your upper back properly, or your rotator cuff is too weak, your upper arm can jam against the acromion process of the scapula, stopping you from going any further. It's therefore unlikely and overly simplistic to think that you just need to spend more time stretching your arms overhead to get there. Even if the problem is tight muscles, out of those that limit your overhead range, like the lats, pecs, subscapularis, and more, there are much better ways of stretching each of them. But through an individualized assessment, you can identify what is holding you back, target that weak link specifically, and overcome your limitations. In this video, I'm going to guide you through an in-depth shoulder mobility and flexibility assessment and look at which muscles are restricting your range and how to properly stretch them, scapular force couples, effective rotator cuff strength training, individual differences in bone structure, the immediate benefits of soft tissue work, and more. This is the mechanics of shoulder mobility and flexibility. We can describe the movements at the shoulder as flexion and extension, so lifting your arms overhead or behind you, abduction and adduction, so away and across your body, external and internal rotation, essentially pivoting your shoulder, and even circumduction, where you move in a circle. Having strong and flexible shoulders throughout these ranges will give you a performing edge. I've taken myself from restricted to full range of motion, whilst also getting strong enough to perform one-arm chin-ups, handstand push-ups, and more. My students have gone on to do the same. Even though I started as an adult, improving my shoulder flexibility has greatly helped me in learning to one-arm handstand, perform certain acrobatic movements, and not be scared of getting hurt. In order to properly train this complicated set of joints, we must first look at what is going on under the surface. Most people think of the shoulder as just the interaction between your upper arm, known as your humerus, and the glenoid fossa, which form a ball and socket joint at the shoulder. But in reality, the shoulder also relies on your scapula's movement across your thoracic spine, plus the motion of your clavicle or collarbone against the scapula and sternum. Together they form 4 joints that make up your shoulder girdle. These 4 joints are surrounded by connective tissue and together form your complex shoulder joint, giving you the ability to move your arm through an impressive range of motion. When we lift our arms overhead, we might reach a limit where we can't lift any higher and get the sensation of our muscles getting stretched and feeling tight. Here we primarily stretch the subscapularis, pec major, teres major, and lats. Sometimes other muscles can get involved, such as pec minor, rear delts, or even the long head of the triceps, especially when we're also bending our arms, but in the majority of cases it will be limited by one of the first 4 I mentioned. Interestingly, all 4 of these muscles are internal rotators, meaning they want to turn our arm in. They are all therefore stretched through external rotation or turning our arm out. So if you want to truly test lifting your arms overhead through shoulder flexion, you must also factor in rotation. I see this completely missed by coaches time and time again when assessing shoulder flexibility. Simply placing your lower back against the wall and lifting your arms won't cut it. This test is either too easy to pass or doesn't give you the full picture. So I want to introduce you to what I call the king of shoulder flexion tests, the Leahy stick test, named after Dr. Mike Leahy. Start seated holding a stick in one hand with the palm facing up. The stick should be parallel to the ground at all times. This will force that external rotation to truly stretch those muscles. Now lift the arm up without letting the stick twist or elbow bend. The moment your elbow bends or the stick starts twisting, you've hit your limit. At least one of those muscles is tightening and causing you to compensate. Lower the stick to the point where you're no longer compensating and slowly lift to find your limit. Be honest, it's an assessment, so there's literally no point in cheating against yourself. Then repeat on the other side and you can now determine any left-right imbalances. Full range of motion is 180 degrees for most people's structure. It took a ton of research for me to reach true maximal shoulder flexion. I know very few people who can pass this test without the stick twisting, even among those who believe they have flexible shoulders. To me, this is the best overall marker of shoulder flexion and an equivalent of getting the splits for the upper body. A common misconception is that flexibility training will make you weaker, or that you can't be both strong and flexible. I highly disagree with this. having built up to a 180-degree Leahy test whilst also getting my one arm chin up. I'm an example of having reached a high level in both flexibility and strength. My students have gone on to do the same. Molly really wanted to get her chin up and handstand. During the initial assessment, her Leahy test was also limited. Using many of the principles we'll be talking about in this video, she managed to massively increase her shoulder flexion and Leahy test, which helped her handstands whilst also going from 0 to her first chin up. She got stronger and more flexible. These motions maximally stretch or contract the same muscles, including the lats, teres major, pecs, and so on. If you understand how to train properly, you can be both very flexible and very strong. I was not naturally gifted at either, but if you train hard and smart, it is possible to have both. In fact, if you want to be capable of more complex and organic strength movements, it becomes vital to be both strong and flexible. Now that we've got an overall score of your true shoulder flexion with a Leahy test, the next stage is to isolate each of these muscles independently and determine which are holding you back. This is part of the assessment process I've developed for testing shoulder mobility and flexibility. I've created this process and many of the tests themselves so that my students could assess their own range with quantifiable and repeatable results. Some of these assessments build upon existing tests from physiotherapy and osteopathy, whilst others are, as far as I'm aware, unique to the approach I'm going to show you. The camera is placed on the floor at a slight angle, unless stated otherwise. This allows for an angle that is easy to replicate on your own in the future, which is essential when it comes to measuring progress and finding out exactly what is working for you and which drills are a waste of time. The full assessment is very comprehensive and too long for this video. However, I do want to give you the most essential components so that you can get started right away. We're going to complete part of a mobility and flexibility assessment for the lats, pecs, and then subscapularis and teres major in that order. These bands represent the muscles we've been looking at. Red is pec major, blue is lats, and green is subscap and teres major. As Liv lifts her arm overhead, she stretches all three of the bands. Now the lats are the only ones that cross the lower back, so if we change our lower back position, we can change the stretch on just the lats, allowing us to isolate them. For the others, we're going to have to remove the stretch on the lats. By bringing our arm to our side, we remove the stretch on all three. From here, if I want to isolate pec major, the red band, I can bring the arm backwards, and this allows me to just isolate the stretch on pec major. For subscap and teres major, again we remove the stretch on all three, but this time, because they're an internal rotator of the shoulder, they want to bring our arm this way, we can stretch them through externally rotating the shoulder. And here you can see how I've just isolated the green band, subscap and teres major. And this allows us to assess the different components of shoulder flexion. So the lat muscles were the only one of the four to cross our lower back. This means changing the rounding of our spine will allow us to isolate the stretch on the lats, because only the lats will be affected by this change in spine position. Grab a stick at shoulder width with a supinated, so palms up grip. Position 1 is to test standing stick flexion with the lower back to the wall. Once your back starts arching, you reach the limit. For position 2, we use the hunched over rounded position on the floor. Here you reach your limit once you start losing the head contact between your knees. Film both positions from the side and then compare the two. If your range of motion is reduced when the lower back is rounded, it would indicate tight lats. For full range of motion, most should be able to reach 180 degrees with the lower back rounded. Next, pecs. Both pec minor and major can limit your overhead range. We can isolate and test both separately. For pec major, we bring our arms down to our side. This removes the stretch on those four muscles we're looking at. We can then just stretch pec major by bringing our arm back behind our body, in line with the direction of the pec fibers. Notice how the other muscles aren't stretched in this same position. Sit on a bench with the arms out and thumbs pointing back, again to force that external rotation. If you don't have access to a narrow bench, you can make your own setup with boxes or chairs. Hold small plates of 1.25 kilos in each arm and video from behind by lining up the camera with the bench. You can then measure the angle formed by each arm. I want you to complete this test with straight arms and the hands just above ear height. Technically, you would isolate the pecs better with a bent elbow and hit different divisions with changes in arm height, but I want you to get the most practical result. Alternatively, with a partner, they pull your thumbs back at ear height until they find your range. Looking down, they can measure the angle on each side. Like this, they can see the angle formed by the upper arm. I'll explain the crazy difference between left and right in this picture later in the video. Full range of motion should be at least 45 degrees past the line of the body in both cases. Subscapularis and teres major both go from the scapula to our upper arm bone, so we can only really test them together. Just like before, we bring the arm down to your side to remove the stretch on the lats and pecs. Because subscap and teres major are internal rotators of the shoulder, we can stretch them by going in the opposite direction through external rotation. Sit down, placing your elbow on your knee, making sure to keep the elbow and shoulder in one line. Filming from the front, full range of motion is moving 45 degrees past vertical. Normally having at least 15 degrees here is enough for most overhead sports. If you can't achieve this, you likely have tight subscapularis and/or teres major. So from a few quick tests, you now know which muscles are tightest and holding you back. So stop wasting your time stretching what does not need any work and focus on where you actually need it most. More detailed guidance on these tests and the other motions like internal rotation are covered in the mobility and flexibility toolkit. Once you've determined what you actually need to improve, you can develop a strategy that effectively trains them. When stretching, we want to lengthen the muscle. Therefore, we want to take it in the opposite direction to when it contracts and shortens. In the case of the lats, it's designed to contract and bring our arm down towards our body, like when doing a chin-up. So we're going to stretch it by lifting our arms overhead. We can take this further. We know that the lats are an internal rotator of the shoulder, so we can do the opposite and externally rotate, so turn our palm towards us to stretch it further. Then with an even deeper understanding, we can look at the direction in which the muscle fibers run and determine the best orientation to stretch and lengthen those fibers. The lats can be broken down into 3 main divisions based on where they originate on the body. In each case, the orientation of the fibers relative to the arm is slightly different. So for the iliac lats, we want to really stretch our arm overhead and create a long curve along our spine. For lumbar lats, we keep this curve but now rotate slightly so that our arm is slightly more in front. Then for the thoracic portion of the lats, it's more about getting the arm to wrap around us. Then we can top that off by posteriorly tilting the pelvis back and get an even deeper stretch. So we've gone from simply stretching our lats by stretching our arms overhead to an optimal biomechanical strategy that lengthens the lats from our hand position all the way to creating the maximum curve from arm, spine, and hip. This process works pretty much anywhere, so you can determine which exercises are actually worth your time. But we don't just want to be static passive stretching. The lats, pecs, subscap, and so on can all be targeted through a wide range of mobility and flexibility training methods, such as contract relax, isometrics, loaded stretching, and many more. So if one method doesn't work for you, there are many ways to attack it. The beauty of assessing properly is you can see if your training is working. If you reassess and there's little to no progress, you can then look at different training methods along the spectrum of passive to active training. Everyone is an individual. It's about using this information to find the method that will give you the fastest and most sustainable progress. This shoulder assessment is part of the process for my students pursuing the handstand. Increased shoulder flexion with the strength to use it makes more complex skills like shape changing, pressing, and one-arm handstands more efficient. We've taught well over 100 people to handstand and over at least 50 plus of these amazing individuals to over a minute hold. Part of the handstand toolkit involves teaching our students how to address any shoulder dysfunctions so that they can excel in their practice. So far we've looked at the muscles being stretched, but there's also the muscles responsible for pulling us into an overhead position. Muscles like the anterior deltoid, coracobrachialis, and even the long head of the biceps brachii. They need the strength in their shortened positions to be able to lift our arm. Training your ability to lift into your end range against gravity builds the active flexibility we need to use it in our practice. When looking at shoulder flexibility, upper back flexibility can become a hot topic. Your thoracic spine is the middle segment of your spine along your upper back. By extending your thoracic, you can create what seems like more shoulder range of motion, but the actual angle at the shoulder hasn't changed. Watch the angle as I extend my back. It may appear that I've gained more range, but the angle at the shoulder has actually remained the same. Thoracic extension can be useful in fields such as Olympic weightlifting or bridge work, but it is not strictly necessary for full shoulder flexion range of motion. In fact, if you look at hand balancing or a full 180-degree Leahy test, you'll notice that the thoracic is actually flexing. It's doing the opposite motion to what you might expect by rounding and not arching. Keep this in mind during your shoulder training. There is a time and place for thoracic extension. I do use it in my approach to training. However, I believe there has been a slight overemphasis on its role in shoulder mechanics by some. Let's continue our journey of improving your overhead performance. It's important to understand how our bones are moving underneath. When lifting our arms overhead, all 4 of the shoulder joints must work together. You can test this. Place one hand on your opposite shoulder. Without letting your scapula lift any higher, raise your arm. For me, I get about this far. We've essentially created a bony block or an impingement at the shoulder. Now release the hand and allow the scapula to lift. See how much further you can go. This is because the scapula must also upwardly rotate as you lift your arm, and this is known as scapulohumeral rhythm. Already we can see how the movement of your scapula is essential in achieving full range of motion. For most of you, there will have been no pain with this impingement that you just created, as impingements can occur with or without pain. Here, I'm referring to an impingement limiting a range of motion and not a cause of shoulder pain. In fact, impingements reducing the space under the acromion often play a small, if any, part in shoulder pain. So much so, the medical and rehab communities are moving away from the term shoulder impingement syndrome and replacing it with terms like rotator cuff and subacromial pain syndrome, as shoulder pain is much more complex. Some authors are even pushing against these labels. I particularly liked this statement by Cools and Missioner, saying tendon people find tendon-related causes for shoulder pain. Scapular people find scapular-related shoulder dysfunction. Ultrasound people find abnormalities in the tendon or subacromial space, and so forth. We should acknowledge that non-traumatic shoulder pain is multifactorial. This video is not directed at shoulder pain, but rather to understand shoulder mobility and flexibility, which are not the same as pain. It is worth noting, however, that there is some overlap between effective treatment of shoulder pain and shoulder function. We too should take a multifactorial approach. Remember that impingement we just created by limiting our scapula's ability to move, disturbing how our arm and scapula move together, that scapulohumeral rhythm limited our range of motion. Essentially, your shoulder flexibility might not even be a stretching issue at all. It could be due to other factors such as poor scapular function. Now, the scapula is an interesting bone. It does not sit in a joint against cartilage like most joints, but instead is known as a floating joint as it glides across our upper back. This means it can elevate, depress, protract, retract, upwardly rotate, downwardly rotate, and for those with finer control, even tilt. These motions are created by force couples between our muscles. A force couple is like turning the wheel in a car. To turn right, we move the right hand down and the left hand up. Together, these create a rotational force, while the muscles around our scapula do the same. For example, that upward rotation, which we need to lift our arms overhead, is created by our upper traps, lower traps, and serratus anterior. These muscles must work together to create the proper motion. If one of these muscles is too weak, our scapula risks getting pulled out of line and could potentially result in injury. So our body is smart. It can limit both your strength and flexibility to try and prevent an injury like this from happening. Imbalanced strength between force couples leads to an unstable joint, which activates your body's protective mechanisms, leading to reduced neural output for strength and a limit on your flexibility. Most commonly, in the case of upwardly rotating the scapula, it will be the lower traps or serratus anterior muscles that will need strengthening to balance our force couples and unlock your strength and flexibility. There are many force couple groups. We can improve these motions through normal strength training or isolate them and target specific motions. But rather than adding everything to your program or guessing which muscles in a force couple you need to work on at random, I like to assess properly and target the training to what is actually needed. Otherwise, if you target the wrong muscle in a force couple, you could actually exacerbate the problem. Inspired by the work of two of my mentors, Olympic strength coach Charles Poliquin and Carlos Castro, I've collected data on force couple performance and created my own version of a force couple testing calculator that focuses more on range of motion. By testing a few different force couple tests, we can input the results into our custom calculator. This allows us to make a decent estimate of your strength and not only assess whether you have an imbalance, but which motion it's affecting. This way you don't need to waste time training something you're already good at and can instead focus on where you need it most. If your upper traps and serratus anterior are strong, but your lower traps are too weak, then you now know you should focus on lower trap raises and not waste your time with anything else. This is exactly what happened to a student of mine, Tim. His shoulder range was limited. He's a strong guy, but during his assessment we discovered his lower traps were so weak he struggled to lift just 2 kilos in a lower trap raise. We then took his strength all the way up to lifting 10 kilos for reps with an even greater range of motion than before, and this was the result. Not only did he gain a significant range of motion, but by fixing the force couple, we allowed his body to properly express its strength potential and he got his first handstand push-up. This force couple concept also works for the other motions of the scapula, and so does our force couple calculator. We assess the strength ratios and look for imbalances in motions caused by the lower traps, rhomboids and mid-traps, rear delts, external rotators, which we'll talk more about later in this video, and more. This is where exercises like the YTWs come from. However, I don't like these exercises where people use the same weight and complete their YTWs in a circuit. They're different motions and muscle groups. Instead, we target the movement that actually needs it and train in a way that allows us to properly track progress over time. I prefer exercises with dumbbells and cables over using bands, rings, or TRXs because you can train single arm and gradually increase the weight to know that your program is actually working. Because of this, our students in the Mobility and Flexibility Toolkit are experiencing better results, finding out where they are weaker than they imagined and need to focus, and what can be scaled back to maintenance level. Whether it's identifying right-left imbalances or discovering where upper body injuries may have come from, the forescapul calculator in the Mobility and Flexibility Toolkit is another tool to really individualize and save time by targeting your training specifically to you. If you don't have access to the calculator, you can test your range, warm up a muscle in a forescapul, and then retest your range. Another alternative is to watch how you move, however this takes a fair bit of skill to develop the eye for spotting poor movement patterns. Because we're interested in range of motion here, the trick is to orientate these exercises so that the most leverage, and therefore the peak forces, are experienced at the end range of motion. A more horizontal body position will modify your exercises like lower trap raises, power raises, and external rotations to have higher transfer to active flexibility and range of motion. You'll notice I use a range of angles, but for active flexibility, horizontal is where the magic happens. Remember how the lats, pecs, subscap, and teres major are all internal rotators. They want to turn your shoulders in, while there's only a small group of external rotators to counteract them and turn your arm out. Rounded, internally rotated shoulders are a symptom of an imbalance. One way of addressing this is through strengthening those external rotators like the infraspinatus and teres minor. Like strengthening the forescapuls, I prefer dumbbells and cables over bands, as you can gradually add weight and make sure you're actually improving over time. You may have heard of your rotator cuff before as an important part of shoulder function. The rotator cuff is a group of 4 muscles, including 2 of the external rotators we just mentioned, alongside the subscapularis and supraspinatus. Essentially, they work together to keep the head of the humerus into its ball and socket joint. Every time you do something with your arms, your rotator cuff activates to keep your arm in its joint. Some types of shoulder range of motion restrictions are a result of weak rotator cuffs. A weak rotator cuff can lead to the arm not being set properly, which closes that gap and can cause a similar block in your shoulder, limiting your range of motion. Strengthening your rotator cuff can be thought of as tightening a screw. A strong rotator cuff increases your capacity to keep your arm in its place, and in turn, keep your body feeling healthy and mobile. Not only does this help with your range of motion, but rotator cuff training can also make you stronger everywhere else. Keeping your arms set properly allows your body to lift and push harder, much like the scapular forescapulars we talked about earlier in this video. So do yourself a favor, especially if you're an athlete in an overhead sport, and take a look into proper rotator cuff strength training. These blocks to your range of motion can also occur when we lose that scapulohumeral rhythm, where the scapula and arm move together. If the scapula can't keep up, such as from a weak link in a forescapul, and the arm keeps moving, it can close that gap and create a limit on your range of motion. So here we can see the importance of proper testing of these muscles. It's through rotator cuff training that we can tighten that screw, and by returning scapulohumeral rhythm through the forescapuls that we keep the scapula gliding well, allowing you to access greater ranges of motion. There are also individual differences in bone structure. The acromion process can come in different shapes. However, a more extreme curve can lend itself to a higher probability of impingement, although the evidence is somewhat conflicting between scan types and classifications. Despite this, Dr. John Kursk, who simulated hanging from a bar in an MRI scanner, claims the overall shape isn't necessarily permanent. What he found is that when you hang with your body weight, your humerus, or upper arm, presses up against that curved acromion process. Not only does this suggest that there is an argument for a 5th shoulder joint, but also a mechanism, assuming enough exposure, to restructure the acromion into a more open position. One argument is that decades of having our arms by our side could result in a more curved acromion process as gravity is constantly pulling down. It's through hanging and brachiating, which basically means swinging, that we oppose this. There is limited research on this exact phenomenon. However, the effectiveness of hanging is hard to deny. Our evolution from apes comes with shoulders that are capable of hanging and swinging through trees. Like most things, you either use it or lose it. Hanging also stimulates our rotator cuff to keep everything in its place. It stretches out those muscles we talked about earlier and can be used to teach your body how to move your scapula properly. Hanging can be done passively, like a dead hang, where you sink down and let your shoulders cover your ears, or actively, where you lift up, creating space between your shoulders and ears. Hanging can start with the feet on the ground and progress all the way to one-arm work. There's a ton of variation here, such as different objects like thick bars, rings, hangboards, and so on. And progress can be made through swinging variations, grip switches, and more. Hanging work can not only help you improve your range of motion, but also build you a set of anti-fragile shoulders. Remember this photo I showed earlier? In the assessment, I noticed she had tight pec muscles. I then used the form of myofascial release followed by gua sha on her right arm. Here you can clearly see the gains on her right side after under 10 minutes of treatment. Once we then treated the other side, this is the result. 32 degrees increase in range on each arm in under 20 minutes. And the best part, we retested over a week later and she has kept over 80% of her new range. I've experienced an extreme variety of bodywork approaches from around the world in my search for new tools and better understanding, some more severe looking than others. During this pursuit, I've been fortunate to work with and learn from some incredible individuals. My research into bodywork and soft tissue modalities led me to Dr. Matthew Martin. He's worked with champions from the Olympics, CrossFit Games, and World's Strongest Man. He knows his stuff. Here's Matt's take on what soft tissue work can do for you.
A big thing that a lot of people miss in chronic injury is this process of soft tissue fibrosis that accompanies chronic injury and chronic deconditioning. Your body has this response to those situations where essentially you'll undergo this process of progressive fibrosis of the connective tissue that surrounds your muscles, surrounds your joints. And what that does is it essentially replaces normal, healthy collagen that's elastic and functions a bit like a rubber band with collagen that's denser, more rigid, weaker, more brittle, more like a kind of rope. And where those changes have happened represents resistance internally. And your movement system is powerfully organized around taking the path of least resistance in any motion. So if you've got a little bit of fibrotic scar tissue lurking somewhere in your complex shoulder joint, then that's going to represent resistance to movement. And that will almost inevitably change the way that your shoulder moves and organizes itself in movement in a way that's not going to be helpful. And that will either result in injury eventually, but it'll definitely result in poorer function right now. And it's virtually always fixable. It's virtually always a situation that can be repaired surprisingly fast. We're talking, weeks, not months. And sometimes when the situation's right, it can be literally within a session, you can make a huge impact. And that's when people kind of go, wow.
Wow. I highly recommend finding someone with real experience like Dr. Matt to get soft tissue work. My experience with certain soft tissue treatments has helped me, and it's one of the reasons my students progress so fast. It's surprisingly common to get these sorts of results in just a few minutes with my athletes, as I target where they need it and use a potent approach. Some of these treatment methods are relatively simple and safe once you have a basic understanding, which is why we teach an introduction into effective soft tissue work for those that don't have access to hands-on help from an expert in person. To improve your shoulder mobility and flexibility, I recommend you combine these tools we've looked at. You should complete a full assessment to determine which muscles are tight, start by stretching where you need it most, and reassess to monitor progress. Test your scapular force couples and rotator cuff, find out where you're currently lacking, and strength train those weaker patterns in a way that allows you to track progress every session. Then layer in hanging work, get your soft tissue treated, and don't underestimate exploring wider into things like posture or neck work. Put these together and you should be well on your way to developing proper functioning shoulders with full range of motion and resilience to injury. If you're serious about changing your mobility and flexibility for the better, you should improve your understanding of the fundamentals. To train smart, you should know where to train on the passive to active spectrum, how speed changes the response to stretch, when to use stretching methods such as loaded stretching, isometrics, and more, how often you should stretch and how stretching should feel. My team and I have put together a free 1-hour masterclass that will answer these fundamental questions and many more. Invest just 1 hour of your time and I'm confident you won't look at stretching the same way again. To watch the free 1-hour masterclass, click the link in the description, enter your email, and the training will start straight away. See you there.